d'entretien. Ce sont des mini masterclass. Et nous allons commencer donc avec un thème qui nous intéresse tous, c'est le succès d'une série, mode d'emploi. Donc je vous présente John Yorke. John a rejoint Company Pictures en 2013 après avoir occupé le poste de chargé de programme fiction pour BBC Drama Production. En tant que directeur de fiction de Channel 4 ou chargé de programme de fiction de BBC Drama, John a travaillé sur des séries très populaires de prime time, ainsi que sur des fictions qui ont été trimées. Il a débuté sa carrière comme scénariste pour la série EastEnders, et il poursuivra cette collaboration pendant 14 années, qui donneront lieu à quelques-unes des plus belles audiences de la télévision britannique. Comme chargé de programme et producteur exécutif, il est à l'origine de séries remarquables, dont Life on Mars, The Street, Shameless, Waterloo Road. En 2005, John crée donc la BBC Writers Academy pour former une nouvelle génération de scénaristes de télévision. Et là, nous sommes, moi je suis vraiment très heureuse de l'entendre parler du succès d'une série mode d'emploi.
Good afternoon, and first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honour to be here. I'm going to do that now. Okay, I can use that. Yeah. Well, I'll stand. Is it okay if I stand? I'll walk around a bit. That's fine. Forgive me. And may I also just start with an apology for speaking English. If I spoke French, it would take a lot longer. So thank you very much. I'm here today, very briefly, to talk about drama series and what makes a successful drama series. This may seem, to begin with, a slightly old-fashioned talk, particularly given the examples you've just seen. But I think if you look at shows like In the Flesh or The Fall, which are currently taking Britain by storm, you find the roots of them in structures that were established 40 or 50 years ago. So what I really want to talk about is those structures and how they work. So that's what I'm going to do very briefly this afternoon. So, let's ask ourselves a simple question. Firstly, let's define our terms. What I want to talk about are the primary colours of drama, the basic structural units. So obviously, and this is all with a very, very English and American bias, so I hope that will go with red as well. Single films, obviously, are single films. That's it. We make very few of them in England now because they're uneconomic. We tend to make them at Christmas, Easter, and apart from that, there are very few. Traditionally, English television made a lot of serials. The classic structure of the adapted novel, the Dickens book, turned into 6 episodes, one story over 6 episodes. And for a long time, that was the basic structural model of English television. But what I really want to talk about today is the most popular form of all, and the form that really originated in America with Dragnet in the 1950s. And even though it is in danger of looking very old-fashioned today, is still by far the most popular model and by far the most accessible way for large swathes of the audience to access television. So really I want to talk about series, self-contained story of the week episodes, classic police precinct, classic medical precinct shows. So I want to talk a bit about how they work. And so let's ask ourselves, and again this is very much with a UK and a US bias, to make a list of the most successful television programmes that have dominated our culture for the last 50 years. Now this could be a very long list, there were longer we'd all go through together, but I did this on the plane this morning, and this is the ones I came up with. A list of all the drama series made in the United Kingdom, United States, that have been successful. And I came up with, let's have a look, Star Trek, All Creatures, Great Soul. If these don't mean anything to you, that's okay, obviously it's helpful if they do. I'm sure some of them will be familiar. All of these shows that I'm listing were massive, extraordinary breakout hits in the United Kingdom. Not all of them, of course, are English, and indeed, as you go further back, the vast majority are American because that's obviously where the form originated. Let's keep going. I could probably go on for a lot longer, but House is probably the most recent example. There's a couple there. Battlestar Galactica is a good example too. Call the Midwife, again, very old-fashioned, but as we speak, the most popular television programme on BBC One, including all the soap operas. It's absolutely massive, and it is, at heart, it's very old-fashioned. There's nothing wrong with that, but I want to talk about what makes it work. So that's a list of successful programmes, and again, it could be a much longer list. Now let's make a list of shows that have not been successful. And it's more fun, but it's much harder, because the interesting thing is you try and make a list of unsuccessful programmes, you've forgotten them. It's so easy to forget. I had to really strain with these. I'm sure you've never heard of any of these, mostly because they weren't very good. Some were very good, however, but didn't work at all. Written by very good writers, a lot of them. 3 of those I made myself, so I am speaking with some knowledge of failure. So now I ask a very unscientific question, which is, what do all the successful shows have in common? Now that is obviously very unscientific, but I think there are certain lessons we can draw by seeing what they all do and do commonly, which the failures don't. Okay, so the successful, first of all, in very simple terms, again, in our post-Netflix cable age, it's less fashionable to look at the self-contained story of the week, but it's worthwhile remembering that it is still by some distance the most popular form in England. So it's the self-contained story of the week. And of course, because it has to run for many years, it has a self-contained and renewable story engine, which is obviously, and forgive me because you'll be very familiar with this, is why there are so many police shows, why there are so many medical shows, because there's an endless supply of story material. What there is also in all of them is a rigorously enforced point of view. So, for example, you will always see the antagonist or the enemy from the protagonist's point of view. You will never see them separately. Or in the case of the form, which is actually quite a good example, you will see both equally. But once that convention is established, that convention never changes, and that convention stays the same all the way through the lifespan of the show. So it's rigorously enforced. Once you establish the format, you never break it. Almost all of them, interestingly, have a one-day time scheme. All the action takes place over one day. Now, arguably, that's a budget-related decision because it's just much cheaper because you don't need costume changes. Again, forgive me, you'll know this. But I also think it provides a unity of time which makes it particularly attractive to viewers and easier for them to follow. They're also about something, and I think this idea of being about something can get quite complicated. I think there's 2 types of shows in the group that were successful that seem to recur again and again. And they either look back on a rose-tinted past, they look back on a past that was better, that always seemed more attractive, where the sun shone and there was plenty of food and people were happy. So life was better in the old days. And about half of the shows I listed follow that scheme. The other half are about now. They are about the time we live in. Somehow they manage to capture the essence of what life is like living in a particular country. Friends would be a very good universal example of a show that captured at a specific moment in time the breakdown of the traditional family and the restructuring of it into a new social unit. Okay. So they're about something. One of those 2 shows, the most significantly successful shows of all time in Britain, have been the ones written around the time Margaret Thatcher came to power, which gave birth to a whole new genre of shows in Great Britain, which are phenomenally popular. Okay. Fundamentally, the characters don't change. The characters stay the same in every episode. Change does occur, but it's fairly two-dimensional. So the characters stay the same every week. If you look at Star Trek, Captain Kirk is the same in Series 1 as he is at the very end. Okay. Now this may seem curious to say about uplifting, particularly in light of some of the clips you've just been shown, but what is intriguing about every successful show is at the end of it, it just says one thing very clear, which is life is worth living. It is about reinforcing the idea that friends will stand by you, that people will come to your aid when you're in trouble, and the values that you hold are strong and durable and arguably eternal as well. This changes in serials, which I'll come back to at the end, because obviously there are some exceptions, but fundamentally every single show on that list ends optimistically, ends by saying, it's okay, life is okay, you're doing all right. Also, what is striking with every central character almost is, it's not strictly a religious element, but you can see religious parallels in it, is the characters exhibit self-sacrifice. They sacrifice their own happiness for others. I ran a show for many years called Casualty, which has run for 30 years in the UK, and is still phenomenally popular. And we ran a story once where the central character stood up and told his colleagues that he was tired and he wanted to spend more time with his family. And it was fascinating that the audience immediately hated him. They despised him for being selfish. Whereas the character who stood up and said, I have to put my family to one side, I have to put my happiness to one side because the greater good, which is curing patients, means more to me, immediately became the most popular character in the show. In real life, it tends to be the opposite, in my experience, but it's fascinating just how attractive self-sacrifice becomes as a character principle. They're optimistic. Again, we go back to life is worth living, and again, there are caveats with the killing and in the flesh and those kind of shows. They are serials, but in the end, they also affirm that point of view. I'll come back to that. Okay. And what a lot of them do, and I think Call the Midwife is a particularly strong example with its 10, 12 million viewers, is it went into a world that the audience didn't know or had forgotten about, and said, wow, isn't this fascinating? It didn't patronise the audience, it didn't talk down to them, it said, this is a really extraordinary place, and it also used the language of the time. It didn't spell it out, it didn't treat the audience like idiots. It said, this is amazing, come and have a look at this. And it used, as I said, it used a language that people went, why do people talk like that? And it's amazing that effect of when the audience are intrigued by something they don't know. It's a very common mistake in British television for people to think audiences only want what they know. But as all those shows attest, they all start with a world the audience aren't aware of. And that's the same thing, really. It's the private world made public, a world you didn't know. If you look at episodes of ER or The West Wing, which are very good examples of the series form, you'll see an awful amount of unintelligible dialogue. That's not a bad thing, it seems to me, because as long as you know what the characters want, everything else becomes clear. But they're not scared to use jargon or professional jargon or mystify. They're not scared to make the audience intrigued. Okay. Then we come to something, again, which I suspect will be very, very familiar and very obvious to you. Obviously, every single one of those shows has a profoundly attractive central protagonist. The central character, at some level, you want to be. A very glib example was when I was 7 years old, I went to see my first James Bond film, and I suspect every boy of the same age had the same effect, is they want to be that person. And it seems to me that that's profoundly important with every show you make. If you don't have that emotional bond with the central character isn't going to work. again, I suspect this will be familiar, but it's amazing how often it gets forgotten in British television. So, they're simple. And again, it's a cliche, but if you can't describe them in a sentence, they're not going to work, because the audience won't know what they are. They won't come to them. Every single one of those concepts is a one-line premise. And they're moral. Now, morality is relative. One of the shows I'm going to show a clip from in a minute is called The Walters, which some of you will know from the 1970s in American television. Very wholesome, very American morality. One of the shows I made was Shameless, which was on Channel 4, which again you may know, which seems to have exactly the opposite morality. But actually, if you look at both shows, they are totally identical. They are exactly the same program in which a family repels a threat and order is restored. So it doesn't matter what the morality is, but it will be the morality of the audience. So the morality of the audience, the abiding morality of the audience will be confirmed by the program. Okay. Empathy, I've talked about a bit. That's really our central character. Again, it's very important. We'll come back to that in a second. One of the other tests, which I've always found terribly useful, is the central characters. Can you imitate them? One of the things we used to do as children in the school playground was impersonate our heroes. I'm sure everybody does that in every country where they watch television. One of the tests of whether the character is working is how would you draw them as a cartoon? And I learned that from Charles Dickens. It's obviously a very familiar idea. But if you can't imitate them, it means they have no emotional hold on you. And you can't replicate and pass that message on. And again, fundamentally, every world we see in all those programs, the list of successful programs, is at some level a world you want to be in. Be it on the bridge of Star Trek, or in the casualty department. It's a world that feels profoundly attractive. The West Wing would be a very good example as well. And they all have a very, Star Trek again would be a brilliant example. It's a very clearly defined hierarchy and status. And they also, and this is where I think it starts to get interesting, is there's a very clear enemy. Now the enemy may change every week, but it's a very clearly defined one. And most importantly of all, and this is where a lot of UK shows go wrong, is the enemy is without. So the enemy is not part of the gang, is not part of the regular show. Star Trek, again, would be a very obvious example. You were on the bridge of the USS Enterprise, the enemy is over there. In Casualty, the enemy is illness. It's outside. It threatens the precinct. What you get a lot of as well, in a lot of those shows, is pressure from above. Now, you don't have to have that, but what you have there is jeopardy. And what you have there is the classic police cliche, which I'm sure you've seen, is someone comes up to Inspector Morse and says, I'm giving you 24 hours or I'm taking you off the case. That character exists in pretty much every single one of those shows. And you get unresolved sexual tension. Again, all this applies to the X-Files as well, if we want a sort of more modern example. But that unresolved sexual tension is obviously a classic story motor, and when it's resolved, phrasing would be a good example, the shows tend to die. So, they're all precinct-based, largely all precinct-based, and again, some of that is for economic reasons, but what it suggests is there's a place you want to return to. And almost every single one of those episodes says, this precinct is important. This precinct is somewhere I love. This precinct is worth fighting for. If you look at the very first episode of ER, Dr. Green is offered a job with 4 times the salary in private practice, and he turns it down. The story is he turns it down because this place, this inner city Chicago hospital, run down, is perfect, it's better, it's worth fighting for. So it becomes very present. So what you get effectively, and again, perhaps obvious, is the precinct is home. The regulars make things better because they fight the enemy. Every week the precinct is threatened or invaded. and order is restored. It's a very simple story engine. Every single drama series that's been successful, that I can't find an exception at the moment, is based on that model. Its order is restored. The regulars come together as a gang and repel the outside threat. Okay. So what you find, you see this more and more because you have this very clear sense of hierarchy and also very delineated mother, father, daughter, uncle, child roles. Again, Star Trek is a brilliant example of all those roles. Is what you're seeing is effectively the recreation of a basic family unit. Where we go. And what I would argue all these shows are really about, and arguably all drama at some level is about, is the importance of family. And this is probably why when we're young these shows are so attractive and why they mean so much to us, is they recreate the experience of early childhood. You join a family that's loyal and loving, that will stand by you, and they will fight and for you, and they will make the world safe again. So the family comes back and is triumphant. The family unit, with its clear patriarchal and matriarchal structures, restores itself again and again. Okay. And of course, what you also find is, in order to do that, each character is a type. So you get the comedian, you get the very serious one, you get the slightly obsessive, anal character, you get the very masculine one, you get the slightly effeminate one. And they're all different parts of one person. So the enemy is repelled by those different parts coming together. When we made the UK series Life on Mars a number of years ago, we didn't know at the time, but Sam and Jean, the two characters, were complete opposites, and we didn't plan it at all. But what happened was we discovered as we were writing it that the enemy was only caught when the two of them finally agreed. So the disparate parts of the personality came together, and when that happened, they were able to catch the killer. And it's phenomenally scary in a way, how often you see that pattern, but also how that pattern emerges subconsciously when you write it. Okay, so All Creatures Great and Small, again, you may not know it, but in England, what is the holy grail of all television? The most successful drama series of all time, probably about 40 years old now. And every year, the commissioning editor will see is what we need is the new All Creatures Great and Small. Which is a bit depressing in some ways, but also happens to be true. And no show has ever embodied more clearly and cleverly all these principles in one program. If you're looking for one model that illustrates this better than anything else, it's that one. Okay. But the most important question of all, and I've sort of touched on this already, but I think it's worth repeating, and the one question I had learned to ask when I made television is that it's a very simple question, is where do you place your heart? And it seems to me that bad program makers, bad commissioners, think that's about making characters likeable. And to me that seems to be a terrible mistake. And I think one of the great advances in modern television, particularly because of American cable shows, is the realization that protagonists don't have to be nice. What they have to do is embody something within you. Because all those shows work because at some unconscious level, you are the hero. It takes one bit of you and takes it on a walk. And that can be Tony Soprano just as well as it can be Captain Kirk. And if that doesn't work, I would argue very fiercely now, from experience, that the show won't work. It just will die. And that goes with all the clips you saw in the previous presentation as well. However dark they are, if you don't make that emotional connection, the show is dead. So, what this leads to, really, and it's just really, because I have to speak reasonably quickly, it's all summed up with one simple thing, which is a clear format. Is a show has a format. What it is, and has been since the dawn of television, is something repeatable. So let me see where we go. Okay. So there's three things I want to touch on very briefly about what makes a formatted show. And it seems to me there are three elements that come back again and again. And the first one we've already talked about, which is the rigorously enforced point of view. The second one is how it's structured, and the third one, the second one is how the superstructure, I'll explain all this in a minute, and the third one is how the structure works. So I'll just touch on these very briefly. Point of view we've already talked about. So for example, in The Bill, which is a British police series which ran for 25 years, you never ever saw the criminals until the police had saw them. In fact, it was so ruthlessly enforced that the camera was always behind the policeman. You always saw the criminal from behind the policeman. Casualty was the opposite, was you spent time with the patients and the doctors, and then they met. So you get a very different kind of show. You don't see that very often, amazingly, because it's very popular, it works incredibly well. But once that's established, you don't change it, because if you change it, the audience suddenly feel disconcerted. They're getting something they don't expect, and while you should always do that occasionally, it does tend to lose viewers quite dramatically. So it's effectively how the antagonist is introduced. So the second thing really I want to talk about is superstructure. Now this is where I think the fun begins with television. And the first one is narrative framing, is how you frame a narrative every week. Now Call the Midwife, again, if you know it. If you don't know it, begins with an elderly nurse talking about the past. The granddaddy of all these shows, the show that invented this kind of framing, was the Waltons. And what I want to do now is show you a very clip. It's very old, but it's worth seeing again from an episode of the Waltons. So if you can have the first clip, please, that would be fantastic.
Times were hard when I was growing up in the 1930s, and many people tried to escape those times by living in other worlds created for them by glossy magazines and the movies. My own family was so close, and we were so involved with our everyday lives, that we didn't seem to need those dream worlds. So it came as a surprise when one day we discovered that our mother had a dream world of her own.
Okay, so it's very simple. And was quite radical when it first started. Again, it's an older person looking back at the past and going, do you remember the time where? It's his diary, and it's the same every week. And that's how it opened. But the genius of the Waltons, and what made it extraordinary, was the ending every week. I mean, this is all a bit laughable if you look at it now, but it is fascinating. Can we have a look at the second clip, please? Thank you.
My mother never sang grand opera, but her voice never failed to fill our house with a glad song as she went about the job of caring for us all. I can still remember when the hour grew late, I would be writing in my room, and she would be working at some chore in the kitchen, and her voice would drift upward.
Good night, Mom.
Night, Tomboy.
Okay. Now, that show used to get 60 million viewers. It was extraordinarily successful, and it does look quaint now. But particularly in the ending, and if you're familiar, forgive me, that simple divisive ending, every episode with Goodnight John Boy, that little harmonica note, and the light in the window going off, was spoken and repeated from person to person around the world, both as a joke, as a sign of affection, and as a sign of something serious. And what it was a format, and it was imitable. It was a format that people could go to work, now they tweet about it and repeat it ad infinitum. And what you find, I won't show the clips now, but what you start to realise, again, forgive me if this is familiar, is the importance of repetition. If you look at a show like Star Trek, I won't show the clip now for reasons of time, is the huge amount of catchphrases, which the current films still use, beat me out Scotty, he's not going to make it, Jim. Those phrases, the same things occur again and again and again. And even in shows like Homicide: Life on the Street, you know, a brilliant American police show, the same repetitive devices every week. The show always opens in the same way, it always closes in the same way. And what you see, again, is everything is built on familiarity and repetition, which quite frankly sounds quite depressing, doesn't it? It sounds like, well, this is very conservative and very old-fashioned. It doesn't feel particularly exciting. I'll come back to that in a second, because I think there is an argument to deal with that. The second thing, very briefly, is just, the third thing, finally, is to talk about is structure. And what you find with all these shows is they have a very clearly defined act structure. Arguably because the form was created in commercial television in America. But what you find is a structural template with act breaks, be it 3-act structure, 4-act structure, or 5-act structure. So you will find, if you go to America now, the way they break stories is they mark the commercial breaks on the board, and then they write to each commercial break. It's a very simple thing, and what they find is at the end of Act 1, there's always the crime. At the end of Act 4, there's always the moment where there's no hope, and in Act 5, the goodie catches the baddie. It's simplified massively, but what you get is repetition from the X-Files to Star Trek to Homicide to Hill Street Blues. And again, if you're telling 2 stories per episode, and they start to get more sophisticated as they go on, you see the same very clear acceptance in America of formats and repetition again. And I could go on as we go to multi-protagonist storytelling. Now, this could be very depressing, and you go, oh God, it's just the same story every week. But I think it's worth looking briefly, and just to sort of slowly bring things to a close, at the American show Hill Street Blues, which was the great godfather of modern television. Should we have a look at the clip? This is the opening of the very first episode.
All right, item 14. Still got a gang of juveniles on 119th Street hitting on old people cashing Social Security checks.
So, how about let's give that situation a little extra effort?
Here, here.
All right, item 15.
Item 15. At this point in time, we got the same purse snatcher, working wolf from the projects on South. He's a male black, age approximately 30, 6 feet 6 inches tall, medium build. Is further described as wearing a long blonde wig, powder blue cocktail-type dress, gathered in little tucks at the waist. Item 16, gang homicides.
We had 2 last night. They're going to be reprisals. You got anything to add to that, LaMonica?
Yes, Sarge. Looks like the 124th Street gang done it.
Oh, pure genius.
All right, last item. Last item is a directive from Divisional Commander Swanson. Concerning the alleged carrying of bizarre and unauthorized weapons by the officers of this precinct. Said officers are hereby warned to immediately surrender such weapons to the custody of their sergeant or face disciplinary action. Said weapons inspection starts now. All right, that's it. Let's roll. Hey,
Let's be careful.
See surplus store corner People's Drive, 124th Street.
So, it's 30 years old now, if not older. You get the melancholy music that says self-sacrifice, you get the repetition of let's be careful out there, you get the roll call every episode for 7 series, I think. And I think it's still an extraordinary piece of television. So drama series is fundamentally a very conservative form. The trick is what you choose to do with it and how you choose to take the rules and interpret them in your own way. And Hill Street Blues at the time was the most radical reinvention of the form, yet the same underlying principles about a family at the heart of it and repetition every week came back again and again. Because if they didn't, nobody would watch. It's really that simple. I've talked about that already, so I won't dwell on that for Mars, because I mentioned it already. I just want really to end with a thought, which is about this, which is drama and reality television. Because I think in television about 10 years ago, this extraordinary change took place in the industry, where suddenly reality television became incredibly popular, very popular with broadcasters, because it was much, much cheaper to make, and it replicated the dramatic hit that normally took 3 or 4 months to get in every TV drama, replicated it every week. And so these kind of shows became incredibly popular. But what you notice with these kind of shows is that, which is fundamentally, I've gone too far, I'm going to go back a second, that show follows all the rules of successful drama series as well, as does the X Factor, as does Wife Swap, as does Faking It, as does every reality TV show that returns. They're all built around exactly the same engine and exactly the same motor, because all television is storytelling. And to end with a very brief example, again, no clip. The most successful drama launch in BBC in Britain in the last 2 years is this show. It's based on a character who's 70 years old. It's a daytime show. It's made very cheaply. It got 2.5 million viewers, which is an extraordinary size for an afternoon show, let alone an evening show. This, there we go, classic family, detective who's priest, make of it what you will, incredibly popular. This show on Channel 4 called Utopia, which is very good, decided to break all the rules of series television, went out in prime time and got 700,000 viewers. And that's at a time when you're expected to get 4 times what daytime gets during the day. It's a very good show, it is a good show, but it doesn't follow the rules, which makes it harder to justify making those shows long term. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but it has to be at the back of everyone's minds. And then finally, just to finish on the last slide, television has changed massively. And Killing is obviously instrumental in changing everything in terms of bringing back serial television. And that's great and brilliant, and it absolutely works on a non-terrestrial model, but even then what you'll find is in serial form, all the principles I've talked about today are still there, just stretched out over 30, 20 episodes. So the same rules actually apply to everything, he said controversially. That brings me to the end of what I want to say. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask.
Merci pour cette analyse très brillante sans le scénariste. Est-ce que vous avez quelques questions à poser à John? Oui. Voilà, ils sont en train de digérer, je pense, toutes les informations, parce que c'était brillant et très complet. Et je vous remercie vraiment beaucoup. Oui, non? Question?
Vous avez parlé du personnage qui ne se transformait pas, qui ne changeait pas, alors que souvent dans les manuels, les anatomies de scénario et tout ça, on apprend qu'un personnage a besoin de changer pour assouvir ses besoins. En l'occurrence, là, vous dites le contraire. Est-ce que c'est propre aux séries, ou est-ce que le fait d'établir des personnages qui sont d'une certaine façon intangibles, c'est rassurant, et ça les distingue de l'unitaire, où effectivement, dans l'unitaire, le personnage a besoin de changer. A besoin de... j'ai
Very
pas été
brave.
clair. Non, mais,
No, they said in the traditional teaching, the character evolved. Is it due to serials or?
Okay, well, I can. What the question is, in traditional teaching, characters evolve and change. In single films and in serials, the characters evolve and change. The interesting thing about these programs is the characters don't change. They stay exactly the same. What changes, and the detective episode is probably the best example, what changes is the character's knowledge of the crime. So you still have change, but so for example, Inspector Morse knows nothing at the beginning and everything at the end. But he's fundamentally the same person for 15 years or more. I hope you could understand that.
Je suis vraiment désolée, mais votre taxi vous attend.
Back to England.
Back to England. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.